You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mott,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Kristin Fields.
Thanks for tuning in to Author Stories. We've got a great show lined up for you today. Before we get started, I'd like to thank some sponsors for making the show possible. Patricia Gillum, World Gone Red, her new short story, Heroes of Corvus, Book 2. A sequel to A Superhero's Duty, Daniel Spires reveals to his team and Icarus that someone has been mass abducting the children of modern heroes and villains around the world. Icarus searches for answers while dealing with the physical aftermath of his encounter with Hellstorm. His powers are fading, and a compromised hero may cost him his life. This is an excellent new series from Patricia Gillum. There's going to be more coming soon. Stay tuned for it. Get in on the series while it's unfolding. Patricia Gillum, World Gone Red, Heroes of Corvus, Book 2. I'd also like to thank Richard Fox and his Ember War saga. Guys, if you love science fiction the way I do, you must read the Ember War saga. 9 books with several spin-offs, lots of great stuff going on in the Ember War. This one, and if you love audio, let me tell you, Luke Daniels narrates the audio for this series, and it is absolutely amazing. We're going to be talking about the Ember War saga more in coming episodes, but go check it out on Amazon, The Ember War Saga by Richard Fox. Now on to our great show. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Kristin Fields on the show with me today. She has a phenomenal new book. When you're hearing this, A Lily in the Light is available everywhere, however you consume books, Kindle version, hardcover, paperback, audiobook. It's out everywhere. Kristin, I'm looking forward to chatting today. Thank you for coming on the show.
Of course. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to talk today, too.
I love it. Kristin, you know we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
I think I knew from the time that I was really little that I wanted to be a storyteller. And one of the things that I remember my parents and like a lot of the adults in my life saying was that Kristin always has a story, and sometimes I think they were maybe like annoyed by it, right? Like a kid that just always had something to say. But even when I was little, I was writing stories and books and like spent so much time at the library and was just like so enamored that there could be so many books and so many writers and so many other people with stories to tell. And so I think, I know a lot of people say like they didn't know until later, and I don't think I necessarily knew what the story was that I wanted to tell.
Right.
But I think knowing that I wanted to be a writer is probably one of my first memories and like sense of myself.
I love that. I love that. Did you have one of those experiences where you're at the library or bookstore and you have the sudden realization that people wrote those books? Sometimes when you're little, you just think the books come out of, just out of the ether somewhere. But, there was a moment for me when I realized that people did that. And it was, it changed my life.
Yeah, I think when I was really little, I didn't think about it. I think I just like picked up the books and I accepted the stories, and I didn't think about where those words on the page came from. I think that when I did finally move into like the grown-up section of the library, one of the first authors that I remember reading and spending like an entire summer reading was Alice Hoffman, who has written like 100 million books, right? And so I think that was the summer that I started to think about the person behind the book, like when I was reading one story to the next, to the next, to the next, and seeing that there were so many of these similar themes. That was the first time I thought, wow, like a person put all of these words on page and found so many stories to tell, and they're human stories, right? So it's not like these are things that couldn't happen to just anybody. And I think that not only did I start to think about the author behind these books, but starting to look at people, even on the street, differently too, and thinking like, oh, do you have these inner thoughts that like people on page do? So yeah, there were kind of two realizations in there, that a person tells these stories, but also that everybody has a story to tell in this like inner world that you see in books. Yeah.
Right. Was there a particular book or series that just completely captured your imagination?
Well, the first like grown-up book that I read was Alice Hoffman's Here on Earth.
Right.
And it's just such a like careful look into the human mind and the human heart. And I think that was really captivating for me. And then I will say that from there, I just, I've read everything. Like, it was funny. I was listening to one of your podcasts earlier today with Karen White, where she talks about Diana Gabaldon and the Outlander series. And like, I love going into other worlds like Outlander, because it is its own world with its own rules. And same for something like Game of Thrones. But then also, those are like lovely series, but I think also just those human stories. And there's so many writers I admire that are doing that, like taking that ordinary world and making it something that's not so ordinary, because you're so immersed in a character.
Where did you grow up, Kristin?
I grew up in Queens, like the book.
Yeah. How do you describe Queens? If someone's never been there, only knows New York in the very general sense, how do you describe Queens? Well, the neighborhood that I grew up in Queens always felt like a small town next to a very big city. As a kid, I only went to Manhattan like a handful of times, and most of our time was spent in Queens. And so, there was like the town that I grew up in, you had a lot of families, and families that like stayed for multiple generations. And so everybody kind of knew each other. Or if they didn't know you personally, I'm also, like Esme in my book, I'm one of 4 siblings. And so if they didn't know you personally, they knew your brother or your sisters or or somebody. And I think I took that for granted in many ways as a kid, especially like growing up and moving elsewhere. Just how surprising that could be when you're just, 10 train stops away from Manhattan and Times Square and the Manhattan and the city that everybody thinks of when they think of New York. It was like, no, there's this whole other borough, and there's so much to do in it. And I always tell people now when they're coming to visit New York, I'm like, don't just stay in Manhattan, like, please go outside of it. Right. It sounds very similar to growing up in the South, where you have multi-generation families and everyone knows each other's siblings and uncles and stuff like that. There's just a lot more distance between us, You might go 2 or 3 miles between farms or houses or whatever, but people are the same everywhere. We just kind of group together differently, but it's really funny. Growing up in a close community like that seems to be very idyllic on the outside and very normal, but also being right next to this magical place of Manhattan and New York as everyone thinks of it. Was that something that ever crossed your mind? Like, does that affect you at all, being kind of right next to this magical place?
Of course it does. I mean, I think that when I think back to some of the things that I grew up with that felt like pure magic, it was like we had our regular life. We had our regular day-to-day stuff, going to school, parents going to work, like running around in the park, like doing things you're not supposed to do. But then, in high school, getting MetroCard for the first time and being able to go into the city and see things like the Thanksgiving Day parade, or even just as a kid, I remember going on a field trip to the factory where they made the Macy's Thanksgiving Parade and seeing the artists make the little models and do like the 3D renderings that would then become these things that people paraded down the street. That was also really inspiring for me in many ways. And another example of like seeing the artist behind the work, right? Like, so there's like the world that you see in New York, and then there's this like almost like an underworld of the people creating the stuff that you see as well. And there's so many stories that fall like in between those two. And I think that's something that I've tried to find in my writing too, is that sort of like juxtaposition between the world that you see and then the side of it that you don't. And maybe that's where Esme as a ballet dancer comes into a lot of this too.
Yeah, and you do such a great job, and that's the reason I ask these questions, is because you can tell in the book that there's this this sense of magic that just really comes through in the story, and I could tell that was probably your experience. So you grow up this kid that's in love with stories and storytelling. What was the point where you decided to pursue this? That did you study writing in college? What was your path forward?
Yeah, so I took a creative writing class. I was like in college. I was like, let me just see where this goes. And I only ever wrote one short story in my life before going right into novels. And in college, I had this one short story. I must have taken like 6 creative writing classes where I just kept rewriting the same story over and over again. And one of my classmates said to me at one point, who had also been following this same track and was in a lot of these same classes, she's like, aren't you kind of cheating? Like to just keep rewriting the same story? And I'm like, no, it doesn't feel like cheating. I keep finding new ways to tell it. And I remember, I'm sorry.
No. I was just going to say that's such a great point. It rarely is a story ever just finished and finalized. No. There's always more to discover. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, not at all. And then one of my creative writing professors who really took me under her wing, Martha McPhee, she said to me at one point, she's like, well, writing is rewriting. And that has been this like mantra that I've since lived by, is that you're never done. You never are. And I mean, I think even if now that my first book is out, I'm sure 20 years from now, I'll look back at it and be like, well, I could have done this or that, or changed and told it a different way. But I think that those have been words that I've lived by in writing is rewriting. And then even when I first started, writing novels, I started with a New Year's resolution to just write 1 page per day. I was after college, that same professor, Martha, told me, like maybe you don't need to write every day. Maybe you just need to go out and live your life and gather life experience. And that's completely part of the same process. And so I started this New Year's resolution to just write 1 page per day because that felt more manageable than saying I'm going to write a book. And then eventually those pages stacked up into Lily.
Did you stop at 1 page?
No. Well, I think initially, like maybe for the first like week, 2 weeks, maybe even the first month, like that 1 page, there were days when it was daunting, like days where you're like, I don't know if I've got a page worth of stuff to write here. But just that was the goal. And so you find words to fill it, and remembering that writing is rewriting and you can fix or use as much or as little of it later as needed. And I also don't write in order. So it was just pages, and let's see, maybe that becomes a scene later. Maybe it's tossed.
Okay, I'm fascinated by people that write out of order. Please explain to me how this happens to you. When you sit down each day, are you continuing from where you left off? Are you getting a new idea that with these characters? Like, what is that like?
Well, this is really going to blow your mind. But
okay, I'm ready.
With A Lily in the Light, I didn't know anything about the story except the title from the beginning. So I had this phrase, and I had actually at that time like an older, jaded, former ballet dancer who was just really unhappy in life. And not that that's, I chose to start the story in a totally different place. So not that that's where Esme eventually ends up. But those are the two things that I knew. And so it just became the question to answer every day when I sat down. And so sometimes that was like, okay, well, she's a ballet dancer. So what does that look like? Or what's the symbolism? What is Lily? I didn't even know at that point if it was a person or not. And so sometimes it's just, you might be, and to go back to your point before about thinking about that magic that surrounds you on a day-to-day basis, or feeling like you're growing up near New York City with so much inspiration. Maybe it was just overhearing a snippet of a conversation on the subway the day before and thinking, let's spend some time on that. Why am I stuck on that? And so sometimes, like as things get moving, it's picking up from the day before. Other times it's just starting with a completely blank page. And I always write, I find that I write about 200 throwaway pages before I actually get to the heart of the story itself. And I need those 200 throwaway pages to just find that and to practice building the world and to play around with the character and starting them at maybe a different point in their life, to see which one feels like the voice. So those and I know there's probably way more efficient ways to do it, and I've tried outlining and really plotting. I think I started a whole really in-depth outline for Lily in the Light, like, chapter by chapter, and I threw it out. I found that for me, it just stifled the whole process.
Well, and your process is your process.
Yes.
And people have very strong opinions about the way their process works.
Sure.
But what I've discovered is your process is your process. And most everybody falls somewhere in the middle between outliner and discovery writer. It's not so black and white a lot of times. And my friend Josh Hayes, who's a very strict outliner, he said you're either going to outline before the book or after the book. And I kind of like that idea that sometimes we're discovering as we go, and then after we have a manuscript, then comes the work of stitching it together and working that stuff out. And we're all doing the same thing. We just kind of go out of order sometimes from each other.
Absolutely. And I do outline later in the process, but in those first, like those early moments where you're excited about the story and haven't quite decided what direction it's going to take, then my philosophy is just put it all on page and edit it later and decide what's workable later. But I think that's also, those 200 pages of discovery are probably one of my favorite parts of crafting something into a novel. It's just you're finding the world and the voice and the characters and the relationships between them and some of the bigger themes to pull out for later. And then I think the next part of it, more so than outlining for me, is research. And that informs so much of the story, especially because I think, like for Esme, ballet is such a part of her, not only her life, but her identity as a character. And she wouldn't be Esme without it. And so delving then into a lot of ballet, which I didn't know anything about before writing A Lily in the Light, that informs so much of the story too. And so I think the research phase for me is often like a more extended period of reflection into the deeper themes of the story.
What was it about ballet that drew you into the story? I didn't know that you weren't familiar with kind of the inner workings. So how did that come into the story? And at what point did Esme reveal herself to you?
Well, I had the title, and I had this, I guess we could call it an image of like an older, former ballet dancer, and something had happened in her childhood. And I realized that starting the story there wasn't where I wanted to go. It took those 200 pages to figure out what exactly happened to Esme when she was younger. But that was one of those, I think it's Ernest Hemingway that says there's a few like true facts about each story that can't be changed. And for this story, Esme being a ballet dancer was one of them. And when I first realized that, I like cringed a little bit because I realized I'm like, oh, I don't know anything about ballet, and that like it was an overwhelming thing to realize that there would be that much research into this project and into this world, and wanting to get it right was really important to me too. And there's just so much intricacies into that world, but that ended up being one of the most enjoyable parts of the writing. And one of the things that I did in there too was I started going to ballets and spending time like at the theater before and after, and listening to how ballet fans talk about ballet. And in the watching of these different ballets, that's where I found Serenade, which features so prominently in the book. And I saw it, and it's so short. It's like a 20, 30 minute piece at most. But I knew that, like, I latched onto it in a way that I knew that it wasn't me latching onto it. It was Esme, and this held so much weight for her, and ultimately shaped so much of the rest of the story, both in her younger life and then later in part 2 as well.
Right. When I first got the book, the cover, the title, and then, at the beginning of the book, I thought I knew what this book was. And then the more I read, I'm like, oh, this is not what I thought it was. This is, Kristin is messing with my emotions here. and she's, it's almost a thriller. In a lot of ways. And I know it's not categorized that way, on Amazon and stuff, but this is really a white knuckle read in a lot of ways. How did the dangerous part of the story come to you, and why did you want to put Esme in this kind of situation?
Well, around the time that I started writing this book, I went through a whole bunch of life changes myself. And so one was that I left Queens, which I'd grown up in and lived in for most of my life, and we moved to Brooklyn, not that far away, but culturally felt very different. And then also at that time, my parents retired, and they sold our childhood home, and my parents moved out of state, my siblings moved out of state, and then it was just me. And I got married, and we were starting a new life, and it felt very strange to be starting a new life with like essentially all of the ties to where I'd grown up had been cut at that point too. And there was just this like profound sense of loss. And I felt like I kept almost ruminating on my own childhood and the fact that like it had all just gone away. So not so quickly, like not overnight, not like Lily does. But in many ways it felt very similar to that. And so I was working on, the book, and then, shortly after, like as I was finishing this book, our home, we had a huge fire in our building. Yeah. And, there's 16 families in our building, and all 16 families were displaced. And that was where I finally understood this piece about, your home is there at 8 p.m. and 2 a.m. it's not, right? And so, that we lived in our home at that point for about 5 years. And so our home was 5 and Lily is 4. And I felt like that's where the story pieced together for me in a way that I didn't expect. It was like that feeling of having the rug pulled out from under you and just not knowing quite what happened. And it's so disorienting, and life goes on, but you're constantly rebuilding. And I think that's where I knew that I had this missing child piece. And I think that stemmed from like that piece of that childhood piece that was missing now for me. But then the reality and a lot of the emotions of it came from the fire later on. So
isn't it funny how those emotions, those personal experiences, to you, probably feels like you are, conveying those emotions and portraying that in the book. And when someone else reads it, it's a completely different story,
of course.
From what actually happened, yet it carries that same emotional resonance.
Right.
That's one of those magic things about writing that's just crazy. But, it's so funny that how words can do that, and the power of story.
Right. And I think that my loss, or the things that I brought to the book, are going to be so different than even the person reading it, and their sense of loss and their definition of it or personal experience with it. And so in many ways, it basically becomes a different book for each reader.
Right. Wow. It's such an amazing book. I can't recommend it enough. Tell me about working on a farm. How did that come about?
I'm still kind of working on a farm, but yeah, I was, so I was 18 and I knew I wanted to write, but I wasn't at that point really ready to be a writer. And so I didn't know what I wanted to do. And, some of my earliest memories and some of my happiest memories, my grandfather had a farm out on Long Island, and I used to go out there, and he would have like farm tasks for me to do. And sometimes they were fun. Sometimes like we did things like foraging for wild strawberries, and I loved doing that. Other times it was really tedious, like grueling, hot, sweaty work in the sun, that I didn't always appreciate at like 8, 9, 10, 11 years old when I was out there doing this. But at 18, I felt like that was something that maybe I at least liked, right? Like maybe we don't know where we're going, but we could start with the things that we like. And so there was this one farm in Queens, and my mom used to take me to this farm with my brother and with my sisters when we were really little, and we would just run around there. And I thought, well, maybe that would be fun. And so I did. So I worked there for about almost 10 years in various capacities. And that was the first time that I worked with kids, as well, like outside of doing things like babysitting. And for many of those kids, it was the first time that they'd ever been to a farm, that they'd ever, been in a neighborhood that had grass and fields and trees and animals and things growing and things that you could pick off of the plant and taste. Or the first time that maybe a lot of these kids made the connection between where food comes from and then how it gets to the supermarket.
Right.
And that, in that same way that we were talking about magic before and living in a city, this is New York City. It's not like we're flush with farms.
Right.
And so, being on this like outlier of a place, again, like just minutes from New York City, was magic. And seeing those kids like taste food for the first time or make those connections was magic. And so I was there for many years and left to do other things. I was a high school teacher for a while. I did do some dance later on in life, and then now I'm back in a position where my daytime job is that I help schools start gardens, and also magic. Right, the fact that these teachers and parents want to create these green oases for their students in the middle of a concrete jungle that is New York City.
Yeah. I love that. I love that so much. You You said that you wanted to write but weren't ready to be a writer. That's pretty profound. What do you see as the difference?
Well, I think that I didn't know yet what I wanted to write, like what stories there were to tell. And I think at that point I hadn't quite moved beyond the voices that were all over those library shelves, and feeling like I could do that too. And it took years. I mean, even after 4 years of creative writing classes as an undergrad student and perfecting that one short story, I didn't feel yet that I had anything else to put down on page. And so that was where Martha McPhee had said, well, then don't do it right now. Don't write right now. Go out and just live your life and gather that life experience. And somewhere in there you will find a story. And she was right. And, I spent those next few years like working on a farm. I worked in a teen center. I was a teacher. I taught high school at a couple of different schools in New York City. I got married. I joined a dance studio. I fell in love with the world of dance like after college, which is sort of strange. Like I feel like I didn't grow up dancing. My sister did. But it wasn't something that was in like my list of hobbies at the time. I took criminal justice classes for fun, like after college. I think I took her advice. At one point I was in this paranormal research group, where you go do like ghost hunts on.
That's fantastic.
I just tried it. I just tried it all. And it was fun. And it was this really interesting exploratory time in my life. And in there is where I found not only stories to tell, but also the confidence to tell them.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. The new book, A Lily in the Light, is available everywhere now. Kristin, I'm a huge fan of what you're doing. I love the book. I love everything about your story. If people are just discovering you, is there a place they can connect with you online?
Of course. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Instagram, newly on Instagram. Both are at Writing Kristin. And I have a website too, which is kristinfields.com. And you can always email me at kristinfields207@gmail.com.
You have a bit of a travel log on your website. Yes. That is amazing. That was fantastic. Just looking through there, and I felt like I was along on the journeys with you.
Oh, excellent. And yes, I mean, that was all part of gathering life experience too, was like going out and traveling and seeing parts of the world outside of Queens, outside of New York City, leaving comfort zones. And yes, and traveling does feature very much in A Lily in the Light and in the book that I'm working on next as well.
Excellent. Well, when the new book comes out that you're working on, come back on and let's talk about it.
Oh, I'd love to. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kristin.
All right, take care.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
I'm melting, cried Joey. Take the picture already. He stood with one arm around the bronze waist of the bewitched tribute statue, Samantha Stevens, riding a broom across a crescent moon. Jason tried in vain to frame the shot without any tourists in it, but that was impossible. From all points of the compass, a merry horde had arrived for Salem's 2-day summer psychic fair. All the commuter trains had burst open, like cornucopias filled beyond capacity, spilling endless fruits and nuts onto the red brick sidewalks of Essex Street. A vampiress in lavender shorts and feathered boots sold maple chocolate walnut fudge in front of the Witch City tattoo parlor. A near-naked gypsy in purple-green veils danced with a pheasant in her arms around a plug-in Hanukkah menorah. A fat man in a fetching blue jeans dress sold amethyst and citrine charm bracelets in front of Medusa Cafe, but his stand got knocked over by a one-armed crone driving a mobility scooter who sang "Choo-choo" as she passed, her stump on the wheel, her lipstick ghastly, her gnarled right hand raised and trailing plumes of noxious cigarette smoke. Chewbacca leapt out of her way and slapped sparks from his fur. He gave a disgruntled growl before going back to playing Summer Lovin' on his ukulele. The old one-armed dervish drove off, choo-choo, parting a crowd of wanderers, slack-jawed tourists with camera straps tight across their bellies, yellow-vested police on segways, elderly rollerbladers, face-painted infants and harried parents, and college girls. So many hot, hysterical college girls that you'd think somebody had napalmed a sorority house. "Jason, are you deaf?" "Sorry." Jason raised the phone and took the shot. Joey inspected the photo and nodded in approval. "Your turn." "No, thanks." "Do it, Shaggy. Don't make me hex you." Jason gave in and traded places. He put an arm around Samantha's metal back. Her bronze body had flushed in the afternoon sun, warm through his glove, but her eyes were weary. No, downright creepy. And her smile was forced, like a Disneyland princess who'd had her toe stomped. "Say chowder," cried Joey, who'd been practicing his New England accent all morning. "Come on, man. Say chowder." "Fine, chowder." Joey got the shot, and Jason surrendered Samantha to a chubby kid wearing a Gandalf beard who climbed up to worship her bronze bosom.